Hello, and thank you. I want to make a formal announcement as we begin, and that is that I have in the past been making a habit of starting at 7:45. And I will now begin to start at 7:30 on the button, so I'm warning people in advance who are used to counting on my own lateness that lateness will disappear. The reason for this is that I at one time assumed that those of you who were 15 minutes late were most in need of the lecture. And I'm now beginning to wonder if it isn't the other way around. So I thought I would give it a try and see who's going to benefit most. I know, well, I face that one too, though. Well, we have a very interesting topic tonight. It's going to be even more interesting because tied into it, although it is not written in the description of this lecture, will be a discussion about some trends that are happening astrologically, how they relate to the Kabbalah, and what that might indicate about a future occurrence that people are calling the New Age and badly misunderstanding, one fears. We'll probably get into that a little bit later on. But first of all, I'm going to review the Kabbalah. I should point out immediately that these reviews get shorter each lecture. So if you think that I'm just sloughing over it too quickly, it's because the first couple lectures I went into it in depth, and the people who are here now, who were here then, would be bored to death if I started to go into it in too much depth. So I will try to give you the essentials so that you can understand how this functions. The Kabbalah, this diagram, which can be made into a lightning bolt or into a tree or into an ankh, one of the most interesting, is a kind of universal key. It was dreamt up perhaps by the Kabbalists, perhaps by the Egyptians. At any event, wherever it was dreamt up, it was a matter of revelation, as all such great discoveries are. And it was amazingly applicable to all the different aspects of human life. It could be used as a map of personality. It could be used as a map of a government. It could be used as a map of the heavens. And most of all, it could be used as a map of inner space, a way of understanding what it's like inside you, and a way of bringing the energies from your innermost essence out to full expression in the physical world. It's a kind of then diagram ranging from way up here, and we've got these three lines, down to these bottom sephiroth, as they're called, or cups. You might think of them as cups that energy comes flowing down, or water comes flowing down. Up at the top, the outermost ring is called Ein, no thing. Simple statement that we cannot know that essence. That's beyond the infinite, if you like. Down from there we get Ein Sof, which is the infinite. Also completely, for us, not knowable. And then finally we get down to the third ring, which is Ein Sof, or infinite light. Now, the idea is that these are three levels of perception that have to do with the great depths of a human being. A human being who penetrates past the outermost ceases to be a human being. They enter a different energy level, if you like. Whether that's happened or not, I don't know. So initiate hunters can put that to rest. You move down from there to a series of pairs that are divided into three columns, as you see. This column is called the column of severity, and it can be identified with yang energy. Actually, yin. I'll take that back. And then this one is the yang column, mercy. Now, the reason I reversed that is because in the Kabbalah, they have a maddening habit of saying that in the spirit world, everything is the opposite of as it seems here. So we may think of severe as masculine, but in the Kabbalah, applying that rule, it's feminine, and the other way around. So we have also the center column, which is called the center column, the middle path. And these describe how we get from this infinite up here to a living, breathing human body down there, or actually anything. It can be an atom, it can be a cat, it can be one of these. Doesn't matter. Anything that has physical form. You get past then the no thing, the infinite, and the infinite light, and you get a point of concentration. Imagine that these three rings concentrate down and create this dot here. And this is Kether. And I like to describe it as the point where God's finger touches your heart, the point of most essential energy, life, and being. It's also called by the Kabbalists the crown. And you can think then, if a crown is the most excellent part of a king on his head and this sort of thing, it's the most excellent part of humanity. You get to the first pair here, which is the primary yin and yang, called wisdom and understanding. And this is sort of the differentiation that happens. It's a line drawn in the middle of this point. So if you imagine that you've got this point where you're touched, and that you are like a starburst that bursts away from that. Mentally, emotionally, physically, that's what creates you as a being. Now that bursting away process begins by a division of two parts, just like a human development begins. Division of a single cell into two. And that can be called positive, negative, dark, light, yin, yang, whatever you like. Everything in the world, then, is a kind of degree between two extremes. All things exist by taking these polar energy extremes and blending them, trying to get them into the center. That's what yoga is about, union. But all life works that way. So first you have this division, primary, and then you get a division of this division to make four. And what you get is that the receptive yin energy, the energy that just is at rest, let's put it that way, here becomes capable of breaking other things apart, let's put it that way. Your primary division becomes the ability to divide. You could think of it this way, that you are a student, and you're taught the doctrine of how to divide, and then you actually go out and divide. There's a difference between the idea of division and the actual acts of dividing things. All beings who make it into a body have to be able to divide things, but they also have to be able to attract things, which is the other side of that energy. These blend to create an essence that we consider ourselves. This is sort of our individual being. You can see how it's along the same column as up there, the spirit, God's touch. But this is more close to us. This is what we think of as ourselves. For some people, it's their ego conception. This is the letters behind their name and that sort of thing. For other people, it's simply a sensation they have at certain times. It's been described as the watcher, a part of you that's very balanced and simply watches things happen. The personal you is kind of sitting there screaming and hysterical and kicking, and this part, the watcher, just sort of looks at your performance and says, oh, it's good this time, or no, you were better last week. And then we burst into another polarity, and this is a polarity, again, of division and of attraction, but now on different levels. Now we're dealing with the mind, mentality, and we're dealing with emotions here. So we could say we're on a different plane, a different dimensional level. We've brought it down into thought. And that focuses into imagination, Yesod, the foundation, also on a center track. And you Blake fans will be happy to know that the Kabbalah agrees with him in saying that it is through the working of these energies, through the imagination, that a body is created. In other words, you as a spirit imagine you in a body, and that's how you in a body happens. The opposite of what modern science is attempting to prove. So this gives you a general idea of how the tree of life works. And obviously, if you want to use it as a technique of getting somewhere, you use it to remind yourself of these various balances. Now, a good way to do that is astrologically. Because if you associate certain astrological planets to certain sephiroth, you get a double system. And astrology being much more adapted to personality delineation because of its tradition than the Kabbalah, which was much more interested in picking apart the Bible and visions and mystical states and that sort of thing. You can put them together and get a more immediate picture, one that's more usable for people like us who are not concerned with exactly what Moses meant when he said these words in Aramaic and that sort of thing. So what we do is we assign, it's pretty much agreed on, that we assign these planets to these sephiroth. And I'll run up again to describe that. First we get the four elements corresponding to the human body, the kingdom, Malkuth. Then we get the moon corresponding to imagination. Very, very profound symbol in that the moon is lit only by light reflected from the sun. And so it's saying that at essence, imagination is not primary. At essence, there is a dreaming spirit, if you like, that uses this imagination. It's a form of communication with it. We take Mercury here and Venus here in the first polarity, the sun as the self, Mars and Jupiter at the second polarity, and then Saturn, and usually it is said that the constellations belong there, and Kether is said not to have any astrological signification. I will suggest a different system here that has Uranus there, and then it has Neptune at Kether and Pluto representing the three infinites that we were talking about earlier. And we'll go into a little bit of depth about why that should be. Now, there's a couple fancy tricks you can do if you're an astrologer and you know this. You can, for example, reflect that these planets in these positions can be used in a chart. You can use the tree of life to understand better what these planets mean. So you have, as an astrologer, certain conceptions of what the moon means. It may mean mothers, it may mean nurturance, it may mean imagination, dreams, all these sorts of things. If you use the tree of life, then you can further fix this into the association of the moon as a sigil or as a planet in the chart as it compares to these other planets in importance and influence. So, to make this all very simple, if you wanted to take a look at how a particular person's moon is working in their chart, you could look up their Mercury and Venus and see how well the energies of these two are balancing by what signs they're in and what their aspects to each other are. And then take a look at the moon, and it can help you to understand what's actually going on in terms of internal dynamics. So there's a little, if you're not astrologers, I apologize for that incredibly boring moment or two, but please reflect that if you had been an astrologer, you would have been excited, I guarantee you. And if you're not an astrologer, I highly recommend it as a field to pursue, either to enlighten yourself about yourself if you're a believer, or to prove it's wrong if you're not. Because if you could prove it's wrong, you'd be doing everyone a tremendous service. And on the other hand, if you get converted, you're not believing the wrong thing anymore. So you cannot lose either way. You could do that, but I won't get into that. The answer.
Top three again. What planets are your top three?
These here.
Yeah.
Saturn.
Yeah.
Here, Uranus, or in traditional systems, the constellations. Kether, no planet signification, but Neptune in the system I'll be suggesting, and then the three outer rings, Pluto, which is also my own little invention. So now we can begin to talk about this in terms of personal experience by looking at the planets and then putting it together. And we're going to run through that. We're going to wind up at Saturn and Uranus up there, at which time I will briefly describe to you my version of astrology and Kabbalah. And then we will go ahead maybe after the break to discuss why this Saturn and Uranus thing is especially important to people now, today. You, perhaps. So we start down here with the four elements. About a dozen lectures could be given on the four elements. That is a tremendously powerful symbol. Air, water, fire, and earth. You can dig into contemporary chemistry and find that there are four basic elements in human life. There's many trace elements, but four basic major ones. And so if you want to desperately prove to yourself that science and metaphysics are reporting the same reality, you can convince yourself that way. If you're not interested in that, if you're interested in understanding dreams, visions, the symbolical tradition, your own life, then it can be very handy to learn how to understand symbols. And there are several basic symbols. The Cabala is one of them. Tarot incorporates many of them. There are certain numbers that are basic symbols. 3 or the triangle, 4 or the square, 7, extremely important number. And you soon discover that these can mean any of about 100 different things, and the beautiful thing is that these 100 different things are in some way interchangeable. When you begin to interchange them, you come up with a whole kind of inner working in life that most people don't notice. So here we're dealing with the 7, actually the 10 planets in this revised system, but also the 4 elements. We'll spend a moment on it. An easy way to understand the elements is like this. Fire, spirit. Water, emotions or soul. Earth, the body, and air, the mind. Now, if you take that application and use it in these kind of mandala paintings that the Rosicrucians and alchemists were making, or use it even in some fairy tales, all of a sudden these strange statements alchemists make about, first you must use such and such fire, and then you must add such and such air, you suddenly realize is a secret psychological language. If they say, don't turn the fire up too much, because you'll blow the whole thing, they mean, don't get all spirited and anxious. No good. But on the other hand, they say don't let it burn too low. You've got to learn just the right balance of enthusiasm. And they talk about the same thing in terms of air and earth. Very handy symbols. And then when you discover that the so-called tetragrammaton, the most important of all magical symbols, the Yod-He, Vav-He, or the holy name, that is also representative of the four elements in its four letters, and that there are just all kinds of correspondences that are wonderfully suggestive. So you can understand that in a sense, this is the four elements in the physical sense, this world, the world of fire, water, air, and earth. But you can also understand it as the cross world, if you like, because it looks like a cross. So you have four chunks, you cut something into four parts, you get a cross. And that is a reference, perhaps, to the pre-Christian conception that the god of sunrise or the god of spring was nailed to the cross of the seasons, which is a beautiful weather meteorological way of explaining that spirit winds up kind of crucified in matter until it figures out what it's doing there and does what it's supposed to do. So there's that kind of reminder too. That's this world, the kingdom. Kingdom, by the way, is a very witty title if you think about it, because it's referring to the fact that in kingdoms you do what the king says, and life is not terribly pleasant unless you do. And that's what most of us experience on this plane, even if we don't realize it. Now then we move up from there to imagination or the moon, and this is the part of us that simply feels life. These are intuitions in a sense. A real intuition is getting a little bit of this in it too, and maybe even if it's a great intuition, some of that up there. But an intuition, in a sense, has its body down here in a feeling. It's also the sensory aspects of life, the dream of life, if you like that image, your experience of life. And it's the dream world, which in the Kabbalah they're not really that different. They're sort of considered different dimensions. The problem of why dreams so closely reflect life is answered by the Kabbalists by saying, well, what other symbols are going to be used except the symbols of your life? You don't know any other symbols. So of course it has to represent things that happen to you. If you have gotten into metaphysics to any great depth, you will have noticed that your dreams suddenly have all sorts of initiatory experiences and flying and all this dramatic stuff. That's because all of a sudden all these great old archetypal symbols are available to your higher self, let's call it that, to your spiritual center, and it can communicate to you through them. It doesn't need to use your great aunt Peabody or things like that. It can use tremendous, vivid images that have been shared by thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions on the path. We move up from there to the first polarity, Venus and Mercury. This can be understood as communication. And this is communication, however, in all the ways. This is communication that allows cells to communicate to each other in your body. The communication that allows covalent bonding between different atom pairs. It's any kind of communication, anywhere where a deal is struck, if you think of it that way. And this is also, of course, human thought, our mentality, it's our abilities to speak, all of that, that dimension of experience. We pause here and say, imagine these as different dimensions. This is the dimension of the world as you envision it, the world as you live it. This is the dimension of your imagination and your feelings. This is the dimension of your mind, of your thoughts, of the communication that happens in your physiological makeup. And this is the dimension of desire. It doesn't matter what it is, it's just desire. Things you want. It can be a chocolate cake, another human being, or power, whatever it is. And you can see that unless there's a perfect balance of communication and desire, nothing's going to get accomplished. You can want all you want if you can't communicate. And you can communicate till you turn blue. If you don't want anything, it's not going to get anywhere. Then we move up to another place on the central column, the sun. This is more than just you, in a sense, when you look in the mirror and you say, that's me. This is a greater you. This is the you that makes the dreamer, the person who has visions, if he's ever had visions or she's ever had visions, the person who works the body, who has dreams, aspirations, deja vu, all the different dimensions of your experience are united by a consciousness that's common to them, your consciousness. You say, these are my experiences, as opposed to someone else's. That's this. It's the thing that enables you to say that I had this dream, even though you don't feel like you were really there. You're really here now, but you were in the dream, but you really weren't in the dream, in the sense your body wasn't there. All that confusion that pops up. That's basically why the confusion pops up, because the essential you is not the arrogant self who goes out into the world. That's one of you, the one who's around the most, usually. But there are other depths inside, and some of those depths are much greater than the outside persona. And when the outside persona says, I am the real self, then we have some interesting things happening. Communication breaks down. You stop talking to people. People stop talking to you. Desires get all mucked up. You start wanting things that you don't want. You start wanting things you don't need. You start wanting things that are very bad for you. Imagination. How many times have you heard people say, I can't stand television? And what do they really mean? They mean the people who write television don't have imagination. It's not startling enough. It's not brilliant enough. Guess why they don't have? Probably the trouble is here. They mistake their waking self for all there is. As a result, their minds go wacko in a mild way. Most of our teachers actually had that problem too. And the desires go wacko, as Hollywood is never tired of demonstrating to us with its drug busts and weird sexual exploits and all that. And finally, the imagination goes. And these are the people who write television. So it's a problem. Now, you move up from there to another polarity, Mars and Jupiter. Now, these are the parts of yourself that, at a physiological level, this is the ability to survive. Any way you want to look at that. That's being able to go out there, have the force to go out there and get the job you need. That's the force to defend yourself if your life is endangered. That's the force to be able to consume living creatures and digest the energies from them to continue yourself. It's all Mars energy. It's also, of course, war and the aggressive and angry urges and any desire that we have to just crush something is usually Mars. Jupiter, on the other hand, is the benevolent side. If you picture Mars as an irate Roman warrior, you can picture Jupiter as the ghost of Christmas past. You think about that character, a sort of jovial-looking big man with a beard and just all the wealth anyone could need and generous as can be with it. That's the Jupiterian aspect. It's the civilizing approach to life, and I don't mean that in any way derogatory to the more primitive so-called tribes, because they have social lives in many ways superior to our own. It's just different. But it is social activity. Dancing, singing, talking, in a sense, is a social definition. This is also shared wealth, or the ability to gain wealth, the ability to gain power or authority. All these elements are in here. The ability to attract, not just desire. Big difference here. It's where people get very confused. They get in here and they desire something, but this part that actually attracts things doesn't respond. And you wind up getting things you don't want. Why? Because this part wants them. And that's when people say, be careful what you want because you may get it, that sort of thing. It's not because the things you really want you don't need. It's also because unless you examine yourself very deeply, you have things functioning autonomously in you. Voices and selves, if you like, parts of your personality that have their own motivations and their own goals. And unless they are integrated and understood, brought into consciousness, then you've got a bit of a problem because they're taking over the situation. And usually, I'm happy to report to you, it's not like psychoanalysis says, and these are demonic presences inside you, these dark, ugly things. Usually the unconscious parts of you are the parts that spirit manipulates to talk to you. That's where your dreams and all that come from. So if you begin to work to discover it, you get help from the other side, and before you know it, the tunnel has been dug through, and you can breathe again. Now, we get up here to Saturn, called understanding, and that is simply limits. And the odd thing about limits, the odd thing about Saturn is that all limits are illusion. Now, any materialist here will be smiling gaily at this point because I've committed the ultimate idealist sin. I've denied this. But I will now explain it. all things are a process. This lectern will not have this form 100 years from now. It may not have it 2 years from now. It may be a pile of dust. It may be mud. It may be parts of 1,000 different plants. Really have no way of knowing what it will be, but it will still be the same molecules that were involved here. If we could speed time up for you, hundreds of years of time, thousands, we could watch perhaps an oak tree, a seed of some sort, dropped from a tree, growing into a tree, growing, thousands, millions of years, finally seeds passing perhaps over the ocean, a tree planted somewhere in a tree park, the tree cut down, the tree ground down, the lectern made, the lectern falling apart, the lectern being junked, the lectern being buried, all that sort of thing, processed endlessly. And that goes through infinitely to the beginning or the end of the universe. So at any moment, we say, this is what this is now. In other words, we say that at this instant, this is the limit. This is as far as it's gone. The limit is an illusion, because this is merely as far as it's gone so far. But it is nevertheless, because of our own tuning in frequency, you might say, it's a very palpable illusion. We do feel it relative to ourselves. But now if you imagine the whole universe, imagine the cosmos as wide as you can, and that it is expanding in space. There is at any instant an outer limit of the cosmos. It is not the ultimate limit, but at that moment, if you snapped a picture of the cosmos, you would say, this is the Saturn, the limit. And the rule here is to remember that that limit, this Saturn limitation, is true of everything. Human beings, organizations, movements, cultures, political parties, whatever you like. They're always changing, always moving, always growing. And it's very important to have that conception. Unfortunately, our culture, being very youth-oriented and extremely frightened of death, has blotted out the last 50 years of life as being completely unlovable, and has completely forgotten something very important, and that is that life is not a constant accretion of limitations, it's a constant penetration of limitations. And that a person who is aging is not going to deal with life using the same faculties as a young person. And the faculties the aged person will be using, if they've properly prepared themselves, will be a lot more powerful and a lot more dramatic, and you'll get one of those lovely old smiling people like Mahatma Gandhi or Manly Hall, for that matter, who you just think they know something you don't know. And they do. They've properly used their talents. But they know that Saturn is not a limit. So when people tell them something like, you're 70 years old, why are you going to start learning ancient Greek? They say, because I want to learn ancient Greek. But they say, but you won't have any memory. Scientists have proven that only very young people can really understand language. History is full of old people learning dozens of languages. It's not true at all. What is true is that there is a tendency in our culture for older people to start believing they cannot master languages, and as a result, scientists can report that older people do indeed have trouble mastering languages. It's all a question of how you view yourself. So we need to be aware of that at all times, and the best time to be aware of it is when we say to ourselves, I can't do, fill it in. Usually it's our life dream. I'd love to be a great artist, a metaphysical teacher, a very rich man, whatever it happens to be. But I can't. One reason why you can't. That's not to say that there is nothing that you cannot have. If you want to grow a third nose, you will probably have a great deal of trouble. But in general, reasonable demands are met by a reasonable deity. And if you want to open certain things, you will, if you really want it. So the first step is to realize that you don't have limits, that there's no such thing as I can't do this or I can't do that. Especially when it's something that can help you and other people. Now, in most traditional systems, we come here to the constellations, which are supposed to be a balance against Saturn. This may be a very wonderful intuition by the tradition that the universe is expanding, because if you take the constellations as expanding, it would work that way. But on the other hand, it's also because the ancients had the feeling that the zodiac controlled the planets in a certain sense. They pumped the energy. And that, therefore, you could understand this relationship as being the difference between the controlled and the controlling energies. Very good way to look at it, actually, but we don't need to use the constellations. We can use Uranus instead, which I'll discuss in a minute. And then finally, Keter, they left all alone, feeling that there was no way to describe it. And the three outer rings, of course, were left completely alone also. Now, we don't know if that's because they didn't know any better, because it is actually fairly simple to get a more profound system developed. They, of course, did not know about these other planets, and that was not a big help for them in organizing their symbolism. Or if they knew more than we think, but they weren't talking. And because we don't have their language, we don't think of the universe as they did, we can't really penetrate their symbology. So what I'm saying is that I may be telling you exactly what they intended to convey in terms of their own languages. We will use our contemporary astrological figures, and so we get Uranus up here. So let's talk about that again. We had Saturn, the limitations, the I can't part of life, and the real limitations also, which are a momentary thing. I want to focus for a minute and point out to you that when your desires are disappointed, when there is a real limit, your desires are disappointed for one basic reason, because you are desiring something out of time. If you're patient enough, you'll get it. And if you are a believer in reincarnation, you know that even if you are 90 years old and what you really want is to be young again, guess what? You're going to be young again. Just wait for it. That's all you have to do. So all that's answered eventually. Now, that's the Saturn then. This is Uranus. Now, to illustrate the difference, let's say that Saturn is like this lonely, dark, craggy mountain peak. Now, how would you feel up on a lonely, dark, craggy mountain peak? You feel like you really didn't want to go anywhere. You couldn't see anything. You'd be just sort of feeling around. And eventually you would get an idea of what your reality was like. You would say, I only take 2 steps that way. I can take 5 that way. Only 1 over here, though. And you may miss the fact that there's a path right next to you, but you don't have the guts to follow it because you can't see where it goes. It may slip you right off the edge of the mountain. All of a sudden, Uranus comes along. The first time it does, it's a blast of lightning, and you're blinded. You don't move because you can't see anything. But what you know is that something is radically different. There's a force that exists in the world that people don't talk about. That's what it comes down to. And then you get another lightning flash. And eventually you get used to it. Maybe somebody from across the other mountain says to you, hey, close your eyes when the lightning flashes and then open it, this sort of thing, whatever. They give you some advice about it from the tradition. And you learn to see during those lightning flashes. You look around and you say, oh, there is a path here. You get as far as you saw, and then you stop. And you kind of consolidate there, and then you wait for the next lightning flash. Some people have that lightning flash on all the time, and we call them sages. They see like that all the time. We who struggle, however, to see it all, get flashes of it. So I assure you, if you have not had the feeling yet, if you have not been blinded like that by an experience, simply think about it. It's enough invitation. You'll get it. If you have had it, and you're blinded, well, then think about the fact that you'll be getting more, and they'll become clearer and clearer. And if you're anywhere along there, you can feel that. And then if you've had them and they're gone now, they do that sometimes. St. John called that the dark night of the soul, and it's to toughen you up and make you think about what your real motivations are in life. If you're doing things wrong, that's the time you usually find out. Neptune for Kether. Neptune has been represented as the ultimate in inspiration, in myth, in genius, but also in illusion and in fantasy and all these things. All these subjects, mythology, fairy tales, drugs, as a matter of fact, for that, any form of escapism, if you like, has a double-edged cut to it. Edge one is that it's a tremendous relief, and sometimes you can get an incredible amount of enlightenment from the experience. Edge number 2 is that the experience can confuse you completely, because what happens is you leave the Saturn world through a flash of inspiration, and suddenly you're out in a world where nothing makes sense in the way that it used to. You've got nothing to hold on to. It'll be a very frightening experience, almost like vertigo. The problem is that the Neptunian energy, Kether, the place where God touches us, is a dimensional world, let's put it that way, far vaster than the one we normally live on. You can think of an upside-down pyramid. So that when you're down here in the body consciousness, the world's real small and kind of cornered. But when you get up further and further and further, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. When you get up way to the top and it explodes into the Kether experience, you have a peephole into another world. And you look through, and that world is big, much bigger than the world you're in now, and brighter. All the things they said about paradise and all that stuff, those were peaks on the other side. They didn't know what to make out of it. They didn't realize it was a psychological state, and they didn't realize that to say that does not mean that it isn't real, that psychological states are primarily real, more real than material ones. So they peek across there. And then you get these three outer ones, which are Pluto. Now, the reason I chose that was because Pluto is the inscrutable planet. It is considered to be the energy so profound it is not comprehensible. It is considered to be time and to transcend time, to be the energy that creates time, the force of evolution, decay, all those big things, very frightening in a sense. They're like the machinery of the cosmos, are Plutonian. And the idea of putting these three rings around it is to say that Plutonian energy is infinite force, and that we do not really understand its workings even though we are utterly dependent on them. That is the world behind the bigger world. It's our way of saying, well, I can say this much about the bigger world. It looks infinite to me, so you get the infinite. It's got a lot of light, so infinite light, and it's like nothing I've ever seen, no thing. It's a very simple way of describing that other dimension that we come from. It's a good way of thinking of it. So this then is another system of astrological correspondences to the tree. Now I'm going to set up the second half of the lecture now by saying that we have a very interesting configuration going on between Saturn and Uranus at this time. And as a result of it, it is causing a lot of heartache for a lot of people. I will describe a certain kind of experience to you, and if you yourself are going through it, or if someone you know is, then perhaps you will have something to tell them about what they're going through and what they can expect from it and why it's happening and all that kind of stuff. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, you can be amused by my incomprehensible chatter, hopefully, or you can go to sleep. I'm perfectly content to allow you to do that. And I can only assure you that for those who are suffering this is a very merciful act, and that your patience will be doing a great deal of good for them, because it's a very scary place to be. In very brief, the description goes something like this. This is a person who found a path in life that they were fairly content with, or they were going down the path laid for them by their fathers or their business associates or whatever, and things were going fairly well. They were fairly content. And something happened. Some people got involved in metaphysics. They met somebody who was into some cult, or they met somebody who was into a very fine form of mysticism or Zen, and they were very affected by it, and it jarred their approach to the world. For some people, it's an immediate death or an illness. But something happens that makes them suddenly see the course they've been on as something they don't want to die on. They start to think, there's got to be more to this. And if they're spiritually minded, they begin to say, I've got to live my spiritual commitments. I can't continue doing this job anymore. Relationships break up. There are divorces. Couples who seem to be the best matched in the world break up over this. You get tremendous ruptures. People lose jobs, don't know what they're going to do with their lives, don't know where they're going to go. They read books like The Aquarian Conspiracy, any of the networking style books, or they read their books of mysticism or symbology, and they hear, sometimes in articles and on TV shows, that there are people out there who are putting this to work, that there are supposed to be companies of different sorts that are trying to put these Aquarian principles to work. They read megatrends and they say, well, this is the kind of stuff I want to be involved in, but I can't find anybody like this. I mean, my boss is a dictator. Not at all the way they say it should be. And they get very hurt by that, very frustrated. They feel perhaps as though they're being persecuted because they don't feel responsible for it. They want to do something good, and they're very impatient because nothing good is turning up. Well, congratulations. If this is you, I'm going to tell you a story, and I'll tell everybody else a story too, because you may be sitting there smug as can be, and tomorrow, whammo, it hits you, just because of the lecture or something. I can be that egotistical. What about this? What about you're a scout, in the American West. And they don't know what it looks like out there, your troops. They don't know what kind of Indians, what kind of terrain. They don't know what the dangers are. So they send you to check. You didn't volunteer. You just wound up out there. They talked you into it somehow, and you realized, wait a minute, I'm not with the guys anymore. They're gone. First you say, it's a joke, right? And it's not a joke. You get slapped with a divorce or something, and you realize this is not a joke. You're out there by yourself all of a sudden. Sometimes you go to meetings like this, and there are other scouts sitting around, and sometimes you compare notes, and sometimes you don't even talk. It's just good to know that there's other people interested in this stuff. Many of you have gotten a good look at the other world. You're pretty content. I mean, you have a pretty good idea of what's out there. You know you can help somebody. There's somebody out there who can benefit from your experiences. But how? What can you do? The big problem, you see, is that you can come back to tell them, but the troops have been so embattled, they don't remember sending you. They never noticed you leave. They don't recognize you. So how are you going to convince them that you really are a scout, that you really were there, and they can trust you? You're not trying to hurt them. It's not a very easy thing to do. The only way you can do it is you can look at your talents, your skills, and look at the indicators out there in the world, marshal them all, and say to yourself, which of these can be used to help the most people? And sort of damn the torpedoes and go. Try it. But before you do that, because some of you have undoubtedly gotten erotic immediately. I can't just leave my job, that sort of thing. Because of this particular configuration, this is not the time to do it. This is the time to plan it, to take small steps in the right direction, but to plan it. And the reason is this. The particular way and place that Saturn has gone retrograde, and the particular place that Uranus is sitting, its long, wonderful effect on everything, is appearing for the first time since 30 years before the American Revolution. Hint, hint. We're going to pause there for a moment, and then when we come back, we're going to discuss the next American Revolution.
Every week, Ron and I have been reading a poem, as he said, and although the word Kabbalah is not used in the poetry, Ron and I have been writing poems for quite a while. I've been doing it on a daily basis for a few years now. So I look at this batch of poems, this stack of poems, and I hurriedly grab one, and so far I've been right. It's worked just beautifully. And I think this one's going to tie in very well, possibly the best. You can be the judge. It's called The Bent Water Branch. The mind teaches the heart, but the mind must also be a good listener. Placing a straight stick into still water, it appears to bend. We smile, fascinated by illusion, childhood's misplaced imagination flashing a blinding brilliance, dissipates quickly, returning us to sleep. Wasn't it Emerson who said, "When I am too old to travel across the earth's oceans, I'll be content to sail rushing rivers in my heart or investigate forests on either side of the road to my inner thoughts"? Actually, he said something like this, but I have exaggerated his statement because I wanted to make it big, so you wouldn't miss it. That's what poets do. Their tales are woven from fragments of memory. Events consuming mere seconds or minutes are made larger, so we won't miss them. Once I loved a woman who only spoke with her eyes. She never believed me until I scrawled "I love you" in 7-foot letters with a straight branch into moist sand bordering a peaceful lake. Afterwards, we gazed in silence at the bent water branch, wondering what each was like as a child. A gust of wind rippled the mirror surface, and I thought, our hearts were calm when we met. That was fortunate. Agitation prevents vision below the surface. We never would have seen each other, pale images passing from numbness to pain. I would hate to have missed you. Thank you.
It was, by the way, magnificently appropriate. And I think it's amazing. I want to point out to people that in general, this is not going to be true of what I'm about to read to you, but in general, these things have been written quite a while ago and have just been picked up. And the appropriateness that they have is really a very synchronistic kind of thing that I think should be appreciated in almost a ritual way. This one, on the other hand, was written just before I started lecturing because I forgot my poem. So it was before I actually addressed you. In that sense, it was before I knew what I was going to be talking about precisely. But under the Buddha's gaze, you can feel sensations that have no word in the English language. You can see doors open that have never been closed. You can see suns at midnight, bright, gorgeous suns as warm and blinding as the sun that sails the sky. Under the Buddha's gaze, you can rise up from the dark waters, from the cocoon spun by whirling planets that set drifters spinning in crescendos of crashing waves. The ocean is a frequency. Double and match it, and it will vanish, leaving only Buddha's gaze. Now, I will be back in a moment and begin work. Okay, so we were talking about the way that Uranus and Saturn are configured and about the new American Revolution of sorts. Now, there's been a lot of talk about the New Age, as it has been called, and there's been a lot of prediction about it that goes back way, way, way back, perhaps thousands of years, or hundreds at the very least. We have Nostradamus, we have Mother Shipton more recently. We've got all sorts of people making predictions about what sorts of radical things are going to be happening. Some predict the end of the world. Some predict that, yes, it is the end of the world, but only in the sense that the world's going to be so much different, which is the latter one, is the one that I will be suggesting to you. And lately, this has, as it tends to happen whenever we reach 100-year, or a millennia in particular, people get very convinced that this is it. This is when it's going to happen. This is going to be great. It's going to just happen quick, and all through history we get examples of this. So we do have a great number of people who are walking around saying the New Age is upon us, and what's going to happen is that people are just going to wake up. One day they're going to just get up and be awake, and it's going to be great. Things are going to change radically and this sort of thing. Yes, rots of ruck, exactly. No. And I'll tell you why. Because you don't get what you don't work for. You can have all the good intentions in the world, and history will prove to you again and again that good intentions aren't enough. You have to put them into action. If you don't put things into action, nothing happens. So what we have is, we talked earlier about these scouts. And we said that they go out and they have these experiences of the world, or you may be somebody who just got froze out or who's just about to, and you're going to start looking around. You'll listen to other scouts like myself and whoever you favor, and they will tell you things about what they've seen, and you'll say, oh, yes, I've seen that. Is that what that means? And that sort of thing. And eventually you will feel that you must serve. You must help other people understand this. I'll give you a very simple reason why. If you happen to have a good facility for understanding symbolism, you might consider the fact that because there are not enough people who understand subconscious symbolism, there are people all the time having visionary experiences that amount to messages from spirit that are so intense and powerful that they wind up in nut houses because nobody explains to them what's happening. Instead, they tell them that they are schizophrenic. This is not to say that all schizophrenics are getting mystical messages. It's to say that some people who are called schizophrenic aren't. And they're suffering because there's not enough of us running around explaining that these things are messages, that they have meaning and are not simply pain. When these scouts, at any rate, come back and decide they do want to help people in whatever way they can, use their skills, whatever they might be, and they realize, wait a minute, how am I going to convince people I am a scout? They get very depressed. Sometimes they get practically suicidal because they just can't figure out how to make their ideals work. It is these people who are, in a sense, like all good scouts, going to be the future of our society, of our culture. A scout is somebody who goes into ground that other people don't go into because it's very dangerous and nobody understands it. They have a very high mortality rate, and so do the scouts that I'm talking about now. Because of the 100 people who start on the path, maybe 10 get where they're going. The other 90 wind up following strange leaders and getting confused in various side tracks or branches of the track. But those who make it to be scouts, those are the people who are going to have to wake up everybody else. Because what's going to happen is very similar to what happened at the time of the American Revolution. And that is that a lot of people who are very talented and very dedicated have decided this internally. The world as it exists now stinks. The culture stinks, the whole thing stinks, and it's not worth keeping it going. It's got to be changed. It's got to be more intelligent. It's got to be more human. It's got to begin to reflect greater aspects of the human being. Now, there have always been people like that, but not the numbers that we have now. We had that kind of numbers just before the American Revolution. And people went out there, and they talked to their neighbors, and they wrote books about it, and they suffered some bloodshed, and they did all sorts of things in order to free themselves from the crown. However, today, the crown is in this country. It's in every country. It's a difference between people who are going through this Uranus-Saturn configuration in this way, and that is, things don't look good, we've got to really buckle down and get back to the basics. The problem here is that we have not got the basics perfectly tuned. We've got to go back to the old traditional ways of doing things. But computers and transistors and God knows what inventions on the horizon are saying, sorry, you can't go back to the old ways because the old ways don't exist anymore. Computers and jet airplanes and all that good stuff, nuclear energy, have changed the world, period. And that's beginning to get down to every level. So if you want to be a metaphysician, you want to teach people, and you're thinking about writing a great deep book full of poetic sentiment and this and that, you've probably got a hangover from the 19th century, because what you should be looking at is probably radio and television and movies and things like that, because those are the places that the most attention is being given. Those are the places most needing transformation. You need to think like the future to speak to the future. So, when this clears up, the people who have been saying conserve, conserve, conserve will probably go into a kind of dullness. The dullness that happens when you see that change is inevitable and you refuse to accept it. These are the people who simply say, ugh, I know I'm not going to be able to preserve it, I'm not going to be able to bring it back the way I wanted, but I don't want to be here to see what happens because I just know it's going to be terrible, so I'm just going to crawl in and try and keep things as steady as I can until they fall apart in my hands. We get a lot of that, and those people can be considered asleep. They can be very dangerous and they can be greatly obstructive to progress, but they are nevertheless not very dedicated, not very active because they are frightened. And you've got the scouts. You've got artists and psychologists and computer programmers and Lord knows what who have gone through this experience, and when Saturn and Uranus dance into a sprightlier aspect to each other, they're going to kind of pop out again. And they're going to be talking and singing and making things and doing everything they can to get across to people, wow, there's this other great place of consciousness you can be in, what I basically am doing here. To some of you, you're just simply nodding and saying, yes, I know just what he means, so you're getting a kind of support in your own experience. Other people are looking at me like, I don't know what this guy is talking about. These are people who are striving to have the experience I'm talking about. And there is perhaps someone here who has had the experience and is saying, you mean other people have this? That sort of thing. All sorts of different people, different responses. But all of you are potential scouts by your very presence here, talking about synchronicity again. And as a result, you have this pressure to eventually, well, it's a binary pressure, let's put it that way. Pressure one is you want to know how things work. You want to be happier. You want to be more enlightened. You want to be of more service. You want to understand yourself and other people better. You want to find out if maybe the past has some secrets for you. All that sort of thing. That's one drive. But the other drive that goes with it, whether you're aware of it yet or not, is what you do with the stuff when you get it, which is when you start telling other people, this is for real, this works, these experiences are amazing. It's as though you've got a friend, you and he have had your eyes closed since birth, for no particular reason, you've just never thought of opening them. And one day you open your eyes, and it's terrible and blinding, and your friend thinks you're crazy because you say, oh, I feel awful, and I'm dazzled, and I've got pain and all this, and he thinks, oh, my God, I don't get involved when he's in. But eventually you get used to it, and you say, my God, there's a whole world out here. He says, you've gone completely crackers. First you went into all this pain, and then now you say there's another... Mm-mm. And if you should even squeak his eyes open, if you're not a very convincing, assuring talker, he'll just say, oh, there's that madness, there's that pain, and keep it shut. All of us have the responsibility of teaching what we've learned. That's all. You don't have to all be Buddhas. It's just whatever the last step you took was, and you were conscious of it, and it worked, that's the step that you owe other people. You need to tell them about it. Because what it comes down to is very simple. When I'm up here, and Manly Hall is down there, and Roger Weir and Stephen Heller are up here, and they're all talking about the same stuff, people begin to say, well, you know, at least these people, they seem reasonably intelligent, they're all into the same stuff. And then if you start to read the historical traditions, and maybe you go to other centers, Vedanta or the Tibetan Center or whatever, you say, these people are talking about the same stuff. And that's the way we convince people, you see, because when all of you are talking about it, that's that many more people who say, I don't care what you believe, it's for real, I've experienced it, I've been there. You have no right to speak until you have, but you can certainly talk about the steps you've taken so far in that direction. And you choose whatever media you wish to use in that expression. It can be verbal. You only talk to your family and your friends and people you work with. If you happen to have a facility for speaking, you might do public speaking. You might write. You might be an artist. You might be a musician. You might be a businessman. You might be an agent. You can help people who are able to express these things. And boom, we have a network all of a sudden. People helping each other to accomplish this. What it all comes down to is something that this fellow, this psychic, that the pamphlet somewhere, there it is, Edmund Rowe, I should say Edmund Rowe, but Jock, the presence or the spirit that one listens to when he speaks, has described all this in certain terminology and has finished it off better than I think I could dream up, and that is he simply says, everybody expecting a wonderful, cloudy, silver lining sort of experience is dead wrong. It's going to be a lot of beastly hard work. Because we're like the people who first started the American Revolution. We're like the people who are saying, wait a minute, there can be freedom, there can be individual rights, liberty. That can be done. And everybody's saying, oh no, the king will crush you. He's got the biggest armies, and he's got this and that and this. And they talked and talked and talked and raised the sentiment, and they got the American Revolution done. But it wasn't easy. And we can expect a very similar kind of thing. Some of us may be here to see what it looks like when we've pretty much done it, or at least to envision it. But then again, all of us may never see that. But a very long time ago, I got a very intriguing sentence out of Manly Hall in asking him what type of approach a person should take in choosing their career in life. I get an awful lot of questions about that. When people come to me and they say, I'm making a fortune doing this, but I hate it. And I would like to do something like this, but I can't see how I would make a living. And he said two things. He said, first of all, that it comes down to a decision between whether you can butter your bread twice or once, how much money do you need, and it comes down to a decision of what side of an issue you're going to identify with. And he said, better to be poor and struggling on the side of a cause you know must win than to be rich and having an easy life on the side of a cause you know must lose. Now, to some of us here who may live long enough or young enough that we may be here when there's a major change, we can take that and say, yes, indeed, we may even see the progress. But consider how poignant that Manly Hall, who is in his early 80s, is 84 now, said that. Because he knows that, at least in this flesh, he's not going to be here to see it. And what he said to me and to all of you, in a sense, was that he knew that he was dying and struggling, serving a cause that must win, and that's enough. That's really where you take all your energy and inspiration, and that's when you can do great things, as he has done. So we've got sort of in him a real early scout, sort of a pre-scout, commando, perhaps, that sort of thing. Now, since I do not want to get into the Let's Create a Renaissance lecture, which would be the next point of departure from where I am right now, are going to veer off a little bit in a different direction. So you all got a sample of it and a statement of it. I will say this, though, before I continue to more of our subject, and that is that the most important element here, just picture a triangle, there are three parts of the most important element here, and they all go together. And you can say they are communication, extremely important, self-knowledge, and dedication. You take those three. Okay? And I'll describe to you what I mean by them. The dedication is your willingness to take risks in service of what you believe, whether they be career or personal. It's the belief that what you have experienced is important enough that other people must know. That those friends of yours who haven't opened their eyes and really think they're blind need to know that people can see. Because if enough people come up to them and say, oh yeah, I can see, and they all describe the same thing and that sort of thing, eventually the weight of data becomes so heavy that they'll kind of peak just to be sure. So there's that element. To facilitate that, there's the element of communication. This is a very big problem. It is particularly a big problem with what I will call the PRS crowd. And the reason for that is that most of you are individualists. That's why you like this place. This place doesn't tell you to do anything. It's an individualist's haven. And I am encouraging everyone to remain an individualist on their spiritual path. If there's any lesson the PRS has to teach us besides the fact that, yes, these things can happen to you and have, and there are records of them, it is also that you must find your own path and your own teacher inside yourself. So definitely hold on to that. But as a result of this independent-mindedness, nobody communicates with anybody else here. And you don't hear about a lot of things melding, jumping together. For all we know, there are a couple of you here who, if you knew about each other, would have an incredible project to put together. There's one person saying, I just wish I could find a gallery owner who would pay attention to my work, which is just, I've worked hard and it's excellent stuff and it's symbolic and this and that. And there's a gallery owner saying, if I could just find artists who are doing, and of course 200 of you show up at Manly Hall's lectures and don't talk to each other. And so as a result, nobody knows what's going on. In fact, I think I'm going to suggest at some point that we, at least in this lecture forum, but perhaps more widely, circulate some kind of a simple throwaway Xerox-type newsletter thing, just for people looking for things, a networking approach. If you're looking for, I'm looking for a such and such agent, and then of course you're all left up to your own discretion to choose whether the people who answer your ads are legitimately what you think they are or not. But perhaps a good idea. The idea then is communication, telling other people about it and helping each other, because 3 people obviously can do more than one. Especially if 2 of them have been along a certain path, a certain distance, and the other has been along a different path and a certain distance, and they can use their collective knowledge and connections to accomplish a great deal more than they would have been able to alone. Sort of imagine spiritual magnets, that sort of thing, even magnets. The other element, of course, is self-knowledge, and that's perhaps what PRS is preeminently dedicated to, and that is through your own sojourning within yourself, through your observation of other people and nature and life, through your readings and historical traditions and lectures and symbolism and music and all the things that we use to refine and understand ourselves, that always continues. Because nobody is ready to jump off at a certain point and say, that's it, I know enough now, I'm going to go out and promulgate it. That's how we get disasters like great big religious movements and that sort of thing. Somebody decides, that's it, I got it, and they go out and they try and teach it. Better to keep growing. Take an example from the truly great artists like Michelangelo and Blake and all the rest of them, who just kept growing. They kept working on understanding themselves, they kept working on communicating, and they kept working on dedication, on getting out there and doing it. So, returning then to the Kabbalah and astrology, and I will tortuously tie it in to what I've just been saying, just because it's beholden upon me to do so. I could be cheap and say this is a great meditational device by which to attain that consciousness, but I did that last week, so I won't. If you want to know about it that way, you'll have to either buy last week's lecture or wait till I actually lecture on meditation and Kabbalah. But what we will say instead is let's spend some time using the Kabbalah and astrology, going the opposite direction, down now, and showing how it works in a greater level, to a wider extent. Okay, so what we get is Pluto, the great inscrutable movements of history, let's put it that way. These are the things when suddenly 5 people in 5 different places come up with the same invention. It's just meant to happen, that sort of thing. Certain causes compound and connect, and boom, something blossoms that wasn't there before. Different pieces get put together. There was a wonderful program on Channel 28 last night that some of you may have caught that had to do with just that, how a little card setup invented for the use in the loom wound up in the computer. And without it, there wouldn't have been a computer. So you never really can see just how history blends these things that are invented for one thing and wind up somewhere else that they never could have conceived of. So you've got this kind of movement. Now, I will suggest to you that we had that kind of an experience. Well, I won't. Let's say that this is the force that causes that. We don't know what it is. We don't know why at certain times culture goes certain ways. It just is that way. You can call it God, you can call it Pluto, you can call it the infinite or the no thing, whatever you like. Then you get down here to the Neptunian energy. And what that is a kind of experiential tuning, a perspective. Again, out of control. It's dependent on that Plutonian energy. It just turns on and turns off at times. And if you happen to be a soul with a particular sensitivity, you pick up that. It's part of what the dreams that move through and motivate you. I'm going to use an example, and that is, let us say that this is the attitude that came into blossom, the archetype that began to shimmer or to radiate at the time that the 60s exploded. It was not the actual experience, but it was a sudden difference in attitude, a sudden difference in what people were looking for. You all of a sudden had an interest in drugs and altered states and in all forms of alternate living and experience that just wasn't there earlier. If it had been there, people would have gotten it, believe me. Then you get Uranus. That was the experience that, well, in 60s language, or actually Emerson coined it, but the 60s loved it, getting your mind blown. That's whatever blew your mind. It could have been a lecture from a professor at Harvard. It could have been an acid experience. It could have been some kind of music. Whatever it was in the 60s, if you had your mind blown that blew it, it was a Uranian experience. All of a sudden you realized, boy, everything's different. And you were part of this other group's perception of things. Then you run into Saturn. Saturn has to do with time and with limitations and all that. Now, one of the big problems with the 60s was very simple, and that is that in the particular cultural tradition, we didn't have a lot of metaphysicians running around. We had our first influx of psychedelic ideation and our first influx of traditions from other cultures. I mean, really powerful influxes of gurus and shamans and this sort of thing. The Indians became visible again, and all this stuff started to kind of flood in. And we poor, unfortunate people in American culture didn't know what to do with it. Didn't know what to think about it, didn't know what was right, what was wrong. So people wound up taking too much acid or following the wrong kinds of leaders or getting drifted away in just rejection of society completely, losing themselves in a kind of Neptunian haze of sensual experience. Or false mysticism, if you like. False because it was ineffective. Not to be put down. They were pioneers, in a sense. All our present yuppies, I guess is what they're calling them. They were the people who, many of them, experienced this stuff. And they went out there, and they had to get their minds blasted. They retreated. All of this works astrologically, by the way, because Saturn also clamped down in terms of time and need and necessity and those kinds of things. And so what you got was the hippie turning into a yuppie phenomenon, which the conservative press loves. And what you get is Saturn piping gleefully about, oh yes, all those hippies who are into all that counterculture stuff, they've learned that the right thing to do is to have a credit card and 2 children and be rich. They've agreed that it's the right thing to do, and they're all happy now because it's over. The 60s are finished. I've got news for you folks. The yuppies are going to wake up at a certain point. They already are. The book Aquarian Conspiracy, the book Megatrends, these are giant bestsellers, and it's not people in my age group that were buying them because we weren't even reading that kind of stuff when it first came out. It's the yuppie generation that is buying it. because they still want to know if there's anything out there, any signs of it. Occasionally a liberal newspaper will publish an article, a full front-page view section thing where they'll say, yes, this guy was a real estate magnate. He's 40 years old, and he threw it all away to have ghosts in Topanga, that kind of thing. And they love it. They eat it up, whole pages of this stuff. Why? Because there are a lot of people who want to know that people are doing that. They kind of don't want to feel that they were wrong. And age is a wondrous thing. When you get enough bills on you, you get enough weight of responsibility, and life gets boring enough, and you think back to when you were a hippie, and there's a bunch of people running around, our scouts, saying, I'm telling you, you guys were not wrong. It was a mistake. You got to come back to it the right way. There's all kinds of traditions now. We've worked out some of the bugs. It's much easier now. A lot of people are going to accept and go for that, because before they leave, they want to have a good time. And unfortunately, the other way is not the way to a good time. Proof, look how happy our culture is today. So we will see some very interesting things when Saturn loosens up. Now we're going to move down from there to Jupiter. And what we get then is the attractive energy. A way to describe this would be expansion. It's the next step after this happens. It's the step of expansion. You go from your limits to expansion. They kind of meet. They go together. It is natural to extend the limits. And so this is the kind of activity that most mystics, if you want to use that word, most scouts don't like. It's business, it's connections, it's communications, it's money. It's all that stuff that is so terrible for them. And in general, what they do is they go out and they find somebody who's on the Saturn side of things, and they say, I've got these great ideas, and they're impressive, and the Saturn side person says, yes, you've got a lot of talent, but you've got to learn discipline, and you've got to do this, and you've got to do that, and you've got to do what I tell you, and they start to do what they're told, and as a result, they completely lose touch with everything, get close to a nervous breakdown, very upset, and continually feel like there's something wrong here, there's something definitely wrong here. What's wrong there is that what the hippies discovered was that you can't change things by just sitting there. It doesn't work. Your own experience alone won't do it. What the yuppies learned is you can't change things by going into the system. The system buys you off and basically ties you up. So what do you have to do? You've got to create another system. And the way you do that is through networking, through talking, through taking this person's connections and that person's connections and that person's connections, putting them all together, and next thing you know, you've got a business. You've got 3 different kinds of talent at work. And it amazes me, as a matter of fact, to note to you that, in general, the Aquarian conspiracy, megatrends sort of individuals who have begun businesses like this already are businessmen who are out there doing it because they were people of action. And a lot of their product is garbage. And the reason it's garbage is because the people who have the product are too shy to get out there and give it to them. So as a result, you have so-called New Age art galleries that have crappy art in them. But there may very well be great artists hiding because they're not ready, or they don't know what to do, or they're working for the wrong people, that sort of thing. Again, lack of communication. Then we get down here to Mars. After we decide to expand, we run into conflict, the need for force. This is unquestionably going to be an issue. I cannot tell you, I have no idea what I mean by the degree of the force. It's very hard to tell whether we're going to have a bloody experience eventually, as the American Revolution was, which such a thinker as Fritjof Capra has predicted. He feels that before the so-called future wave arrives, there will be violent revolution, possible. Whether it means that certain people disappear early on, assassinations in the Gandhi mode, that sort of thing, that's possible too. Whatever it is, it means there's going to be a need for conflict and a need for force. And it's going to take very dedicated people to get out there, and after they build their businesses and a giant conglomerate figures out, oh my God, they're going to put us out of business, and starts doing something about it, there's got to be an ability there to fight back, in the Gandhi sense, non-violently. Not to be vicious, but to know laws, to know those things, to really be diligent, to be pursuing your belief system and your dedication with as much verve and dedication as the most inspired fascist. Because it's rather a shame on spiritually minded people that they haven't got as much dedication as a fascist does. That they're not willing to live their life that completely. Well, we move from Mars and we get to the Sun. That can be understood several ways. It can be understood as the essence of the entire thing. It can be understood as the culmination, the birth of the experience, where actually a new order is established, whatever you like. There's several ways of seeing it. But the main point of it is, again, this idea of expression. Because what the conflict has to do with is the necessity of expressing these things. The conflict is not one that should have itself fought on the battlefield of money and earnings and stocks and that sort of thing. It needs to be focused on what is reality, on what have I experienced, on how can your life be improved. How can we have greater arts, greater happiness, greater communication? How can we clear up many of the problems that we face? How can we be more creative, period? It's all about creativity then. That's the essence of it. What will we create once we get to the point where force is being applied? We move from there to Venus, and this is the power of attraction, desire in a sense. This is the power that ensouls the activity that's truly balanced with beauty and with the ability to attract people. You know, you run into a great many people involved in New Age ventures who just don't get anywhere, and the reason they don't get anywhere is they're out of balance. They're trying to do one thing when the other thing's off, and the personal side is completely messed up, but they're trying to do it in business, that sort of thing. It's not a balanced situation. And they don't attract anything, and their activity doesn't have any of the earmarks of beauty. But you do have activities that are quite beautiful. I would suggest to you that although, despite the decades that it's been here, that if you walk into the PRS library at the right moment, there's nobody there or whatever, you get a real sense of beauty. There's an aesthetic beauty in the experience. And that's because the organization, on the whole, was put together in a very balanced, beautiful way. And then again, it has the ability to attract. So it's been put together that way. Now the problem, of course, in Venus is that it will work for anything that's well balanced. So you can get a great big fascist movement that attracts all kinds of people because it's nicely balanced. It's put together intelligently. That brings us to Mercury, which is the way we judge whether the attraction system we're building is good or not. Actually, we want to listen to intuition and all the stuff up here, too, but the mind is the thing that's going to let us look out and say, these are the fruits the activity is producing, and that's the most important thing. If you have any questions about an activity that you have been asked to associate with, or if you have any questions about an activity a friend or a relative is associated with, remember what Jesus said. By their fruit ye shall judge them. Look at the people involved. Now, at the risk of being insulting, I will mention a name and point out that there were many people who did not need to wait for the scandal that has recently rocked Rajneesh. They just looked, and they saw immediately what was going on because the fruit was not good. That's simple. And so you look around and you judge things that way. Fundamental Christianity, for example, happens to have some really tremendous points it's trying to say, and New Agers will be horrified to realize that in many ways fundamentalists are allies. And the biggest mistake that both are making is by hating each other's guts. They're both breaking their innermost principles by doing that. But fundamentalism, again, if you're a mystic and you do want to fight about it, you look at the fruit. You say, yes, some things, definitely. Feeding the starving, all sorts of stuff that metaphysicians should be shamed by. But, on the other hand, the people that I've met who are born-again Christians, and particularly dedicated ones, were like rabid animals. I was trying to get them to shut up about their belief system and leave me alone for a minute. That is not good fruit. So you can look at things that way. And, of course, each person judges that for themselves. But this is how we judge our system. As we begin it, we look around, we say, what's the fruit? Are people coming back to us and saying, this has happened, it's very exciting, I feel much better, this or that. And even then we say, okay, these are the flatterers. We assume that right away and say, let's go look at the ones who don't come back and see what happens. What's the effect we're having? Any negative stuff? And you judge the balance there. And if you discover that you're doing harm, you stop it, something that our film industry and 90% of our industries in general have not realized. Science, in fact, has not realized. That if you can do it, you don't just do it because you can. You see what the effect is. And if you feel that the effect is no good, you don't do it. You change it, you modify it, you attempt to improve it in some way, to protect it. Mercury. Then we get down to the moon, and this has a double meaning. If you're an astrologer, you know that the moon means the public. So you can simply say, this is the public that we reach. This is how we attract them, this is how we judge and balance all this, and then the moon here, Yesod, that is the actual public. It's the imagination of the organization. And a good way to picture that is if you consider the PRS, all of you have ideas about what metaphysics means. All of you have ideas about what PRS means. So in a sense, you are all elements in the imagination of the PRS on one dimension. You, of course, have billions of other dimensions that you work with, but that's one of them. And so any organization, any movement, even a small business or an activity, a tutorial activity, whatever you happen to be doing, it has that kind of a radiant effect. You have an effect on other people. You have a little world in their minds. They become an imagination. And what most people don't realize is that that imagination has a life of its own. And it begins to come back and affect the original. It's kind of a loop circuit. If this loop is made, you get a long-lasting activity, very beneficial. If a loop isn't made, then it's sort of a bright flare and it's gone. So you might say that, in a sense, formal Christianity, Catholic Christianity, did a good balancing system here. Unfortunately, when it got down to Mercury, it looked around and it said, the fruit looks great, we're rich. It really did. Not all of them, but a great many of them. We're powerful and we're rich. And it did plug in very well with the imagination of its public and recircuited it. And so the public began to create the church and vice versa. You have a symbiotic relationship happening. And that's why the Catholic Church is such a populist religion. Perhaps of all religions, the most populist. That's also why it survived the length of time that it has. It is a kind of reflection of the imaginations of millions of people. And of course, that is part of the way that it justifies itself. And then finally, you get down to the four elements, and that's the material world that you're actually doing the work in. It's the stuff that you're using to build, that sort of thing. It is the people you have not reached yet, the people you'll never reach, the people trying to take you down, the people trying to help you, the laws for and against, all that stuff is Malkuth. That's the physical, factual thing you have to deal with. And so in a sense, you can see how you don't really get to this until the activity is developing to a certain extent. I want to go back for a minute and stress the communication element by pointing out that most people who are approaching this are thinking of it in terms of they want to do something. They have an idea. They have a gift they want to apply, whatever. And they look around them and they feel that they cannot fit into the existing system. And they don't know what to do. They get extremely frustrated. They look around and say, I have this skill, I think it's important, I think people need to hear it, but there is no way for me to reach people. I have nowhere to stand. I have no voice. I have nothing, no reason for them to accept that I am a scout, put it that way. The only way for a person to accept that you are a scout is if they recognize you are a scout, and the only people who are going to recognize that you're a scout are other scouts. And the only way that all of us scouts can get across to the world, the non-believing troops, that we really have seen something is if there's 1,000 scouts standing there saying, yes, we all saw this. And we're all going to tell you from our own personal angles what we saw. So what that means is that people have to go out, scouts have to go out and organize, shake hands, meet each other, names, pass business cards around, be willing to take risks so that they can form a unit of sorts, a network, again, of individuals dedicated to getting across a certain idea. I will illustrate this very briefly and then close. The illustration will be what happens when you get a fellow who wants to go into publishing, wants to publish worthwhile books but has no backing, doesn't know what he's got to do. A fellow who's been in book distribution for years and can't imagine what he can do with it that's useful, because the books that he's dealing with are garbage and nobody's writing good stuff, and the presidents and editors of the existing publishing companies aren't doing anything, but this guy's got all the contacts. A great author just waiting to happen, but unacceptable because his work is too esoteric for the people editing it, the Saturnian minds. And a person who's got some money that they would like to invest in a worthwhile project, but they can't find a worthwhile project, so they send it to the City of Hope again this year, even though they'd like to get into something a little more interesting that they might even be able to get their fingers wet in. You take those four people, put them in a room, and introduce them to each other, and all of them are willing to listen and to talk to each other and to take risks, and you now have a publishing company. You've got the money, you've got the connections, you've got the talent, you've got the dedication, it's all there. And I guarantee you that there have been times at this lecture hall, and especially downstairs when Manly Hall has been lecturing, that has happened, and those four people have never met each other. And that is because of lack of communication. I'm, unfortunately, I have to tell you, going to harp on this ceaselessly for a while now. If you come again, you can come to expect to hear some of it if you need a refresher or see what other insights there are. But in a sense, the lectures are meetings. I will hopefully organize some means for at least, again, this lecture group to communicate amongst themselves with a form of classified advertisement expression, that sort of thing. So if anybody's looking for a certain kind of thing, you can do it anonymously and not be embarrassed. If we get even one new activity based on that, it will have been worthwhile. But of course, you have to do that yourselves. You've got to have the nerve, or the chutzpah, as it's said in Hebrew, to go out and talk to people. Just say, I've got a feeling. I've always remembered this one. About several years ago, before I really was involved in metaphysics, I was at a restaurant, and there was a lady sitting at the next table, and she kept looking at me. She was older than I was, and I didn't think that she was looking at me for any, shall we say, less than spiritual reasons. And eventually she came over to the table and said, I just have this feeling that you have something to say to the world. I'm a book agent. I said, I don't have a thing to say. I wish I could find her now. But it took a lot of courage for her to do that, to walk up to a complete stranger in a nice fancy restaurant and say something like, you look like somebody who has something to say and I'm an agent. If we all start doing that, boy, are things going to start changing rapidly. And these are small steps. So, in closing, I think you will see, in case you don't, if you don't see this, then buy the lecture. These really do interact, these ideas. I've demonstrated to you how this movement works on the Kabbalistic tree and astrologically. And most important of all, the lecture itself has been a demonstration of how this stuff works. Because I am not standing up here with an invisible well of profundity, ladling it out. I live through it. Sometimes very hard and very, very disconcerting. And then I come in and I say, guess what? This is what I figured out today. I could not have given you this lecture a week ago. That's the way it works. Whatever step you take, you help other people take that step. You do the most you can to reach them without forcing things. And that is being on the spiritual path. Because as you use what you've learned, you get more. And that's the beauty of it. That's the way real teaching works. Teaching should be a process of self-discovery as well as giving things to other people. So I'm charging all of you then to become extroverts overnight. But definitely during breaks or after lectures, or if you're downstairs and eating cookies after Mr. Hall lectures, or if you're at work or you're among friends, whatever, think about this. Think about the fact that standing next to you may be a person who could fulfill your wildest dreams and you could fulfill theirs. And the only reason you don't know it is because you haven't talked. And it doesn't take much to find out. Generally, if you have any perception or sensitivity at all, you can read people pretty quick. Most of the scouts can, because I might finally add that scouts, like their real-life Western counterparts, are usually paranoid and hypersensitive. So if you are hypersensitive and paranoid, you are a scout. So all you need to do is look around for other paranoid, hypersensitive people and recognize the signs when you talk to them. And next thing you know, you may be involved in a whole new world. Thank you, and good night.